Humorous stories about famous men. Part 1. Everyone has heard of Rachmaninoff. He was a very famous pianist. He was also a famous composer of music. Rachmaninoff liked to tell this story about himself. When I was a small boy, I once played at a party at the home of a Russian nobleman. I was only 8 years old, but I had been playing the piano for several years. I played well. The piece which I played was the Kreutzer Sonata by Beethoven. I played the piece very well. At least, I thought so. But the Kreutzer Sonata, as you know, has in it several very long rests. In each of these rests, I took my hands from the piano and waited. To me, this was very dramatic, but it seems that the mother of the nobleman thought differently. She was a very pleasant old lady. Finally, during one of these rests, she came over to me. She touched me on the head kindly and said, "My boy, why don't you play us something that you know?" Everyone has heard of Sherlock Holmes. Everyone has read stories about Sherlock Holmes at one time or another. Sherlock Holmes was a detective. He was the most famous detective of all time. In every story, Holmes always showed his great ability as a detective immediately by telling the whole history of a person simply by looking at that person. Holmes looked at a man's hands. He noticed a small mark on the man's neck. Holmes knew at once that the man had been a soldier, that he spent 4 years in India, and so on. The author of all Sherlock Holmes stories was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Once, Sir Arthur was in Paris. He rode in a taxi from the railroad station to the hotel where he was going to spend the night. He arrived at the hotel. He got out of the taxi and paid the driver. "Thank you very much, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle," said the taxi driver, smiling. "How do you know who I am?" said Sir Arthur. He was very surprised. "Well, sir, I read in the newspaper yesterday that you were coming to Paris from the south of France. The train on which you arrived came from the south of France. I also noticed that your hair was last cut by a barber in the south of France. Your clothes, and especially your hat, told me that you were English. I put all this together, and I knew at once that you were Sir Arthur Conan Doyle." "That is wonderful," said Sir Arthur. "With so few facts, you are really able to know me?" "Of course," said the taxi driver. "Your name is on both sides of your travel bags. That also helped." Part 2. Al Smith was governor of New York State. He was a famous man. He was born very poor on the east side of New York City. He had little education. He worked very hard and won great success. One day, as governor, he was visiting the state prison at Sing Sing. Sing Sing is one of the largest prisons in the United States. The head of the prison asked Mr. Smith to say something to the prisoners. Mr. Smith had never spoken to this kind of audience before. He did not know how to begin. Finally, he said, "My fellow citizens." Then he remembered that when a man goes to prison, he is no longer a citizen. He began again, "My fellow prisoners." That did not sound right. So he said, "Well, anyway, I'm glad to see so many of you here today." President William Howard Taft was a very fat man. He weighed more than 300 pounds. Certainly, he was the fattest president that the United States has ever had. Once he told this story about himself. "I know a little boy who is always biting his nails. One day his mother said to him, 'Do you know what will happen to you if you continue to bite your nails?' 'No. What will happen to me?' 'You will swell up like a big balloon and explode.' The boy seemed very frightened by this. He stopped biting his nails. About a month later, I was visiting their home. I was sitting at the dinner table when the boy came into the room. He looked at me strangely. He walked over to me. He said very seriously, 'Mr. Taft, I bet you bite your nails.